Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning and something has shifted. The world looks the same, but suddenly you can see the strings. The carefully orchestrated dance of social media feeds is designed to trigger your emotions. The subtle manipulation in every advertisement, every news headline, every political speech. The unconscious performance everyone around you participates in without even realizing they're actors in a play they never auditioned for. This isn't paranoia. This isn't conspiracy thinking. This is the terrifying moment of philosophical awakening that Friedrich Nietzsche warned us about over a century ago. The moment when you begin to see what others don't, and discover that this gift of clarity might be the most dangerous thing that could ever happen to your mind. Most people live their entire lives within comfortable frameworks of meaning. They wake up, check their phones, absorb the day's narrative, react predictably to carefully crafted stimuli, and go to sleep believing they've lived an authentic day. They find comfort in shared beliefs, security in common assumptions, and identity in collective stories that feel as natural as breathing. But what happens when you can no longer unsee the architecture behind these stories? When you recognize that social media algorithms don't show you reality, they show you a carefully curated version designed to keep you scrolling, clicking, purchasing, voting in predictable patterns. When you realize that news outlets don't just report events, they craft narratives that serve specific agendas, shaping not just what you think about, but how you think about it. The moment you see through one illusion, others begin to crumble. You start recognizing the performance of authenticity in online spaces. You notice how consumer culture creates artificial needs and then sells you solutions. You observe how political movements manufacture outrage to maintain engagement. You see how educational systems teach compliance more than critical thinking. And then comes the isolation, because once you see these mechanisms, you can't participate in them with the same innocent enthusiasm. You become like someone who knows how a magic trick works, watching an audience gasp in wonder at what you now recognize as simple sleight of hand. You want to share what you've discovered, but find that most people prefer the magic to the method, the comfort of illusion to the burden of truth. Nietzsche called this the beginning of a dangerous journey. Dangerous not because the truth itself will harm you, but because the human psyche isn't designed to handle unlimited reality without protective frameworks. We need stories, meanings, and shared assumptions to function in society. But what happens to those who can no longer believe in these necessary fictions? This is where we find ourselves standing at the edge of an abyss that Nietzsche described with chilling precision, the space between comfortable delusion and overwhelming truth, where the most perceptive minds throughout history have found themselves trapped. Some have been destroyed by what they've seen. Others have found ways to transform their burden into wisdom, but all have paid a price for seeing what others cannot or will not see. Friedrich Nietzsche wasn't just a philosopher, he was a prophet of psychological destruction, a man who lived every warning he ever wrote about the dangers of seeing too clearly. Born in 1844 in a small German town, he began his intellectual journey as a promising classical scholar, celebrated by his peers, appointed to a university professorship at the unprecedented age of 24. But this promising beginning would become the prologue to one of history's most tragic examples of a mind destroyed by its own clarity. Nietzsche saw through the comfortable illusions of his time with surgical precision. While others celebrated the progress of 19th-century European civilization, he recognized the psychological and spiritual void lurking beneath its confident surface. While others found meaning in traditional religious and moral frameworks, he diagnosed these as elaborate constructions designed to help humans avoid confronting the terrifying meaninglessness of existence. His most famous declaration, "But God is dead," wasn't a celebration, but a funeral announcement. Nietzsche recognized that the shared meaning-making systems that had held European society together for over 1,000 years were crumbling under the weight of scientific rationalism and historical criticism. But unlike others who either celebrated or mourned this development, Nietzsche understood its psychological implications with terrifying clarity. When shared meaning systems collapse, individual minds must either create their own frameworks of value and purpose or be crushed by the weight of infinite possibility and ultimate meaninglessness. This is where Nietzsche introduced his concept of the Übermensch, not a master race as later distortions would claim, but individuals strong enough to create their own values after seeing through all inherited systems of meaning. But Nietzsche also recognized that most minds aren't equipped for this psychological challenge. In his notebooks, he wrote about different types of human beings, the many who live contentedly within inherited illusions, never questioning the frameworks that give their lives structure and meaning, the few who begin to question but quickly retreat into new forms of self-deception when the questioning becomes too uncomfortable, and the rare individuals who push through to genuine philosophical independence at enormous personal cost. He himself exemplified this third category. As his insights deepened, his social isolation increased. His books found few readers during his lifetime. His relationships deteriorated as his thinking became more radical and his personality more intense. Friends and colleagues found him increasingly difficult to be around, not because he was cruel or irrational, but because his clear sight into the nature of society and human psychology made normal social interaction nearly impossible. Nietzsche's famous warning about staring into the abyss, "He who fights monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. And if thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee," wasn't metaphorical speculation. It was an autobiographical confession. He had gazed into the abyss of meaninglessness and felt it transform his mind in ways that ultimately led to his psychological collapse. By 1889, at age 44, Nietzsche suffered a complete mental breakdown from which he never recovered. He spent his final years in a state of childlike dependency, cared for by his mother and sister, his brilliant mind reduced to fragments. Whether this breakdown resulted from syphilis, a brain tumor, or the psychological pressure of carrying unbearable insights, we may never know. But the timing suggests a connection between his intellectual isolation and his mental collapse. This is the warning Nietzsche left us: the human mind has limits. Push too far beyond the comfortable boundaries of shared meaning. See too clearly through the necessary illusions that make social life possible, and you may find yourself in psychological territory that no human psyche can navigate safely. The very clarity that feels like enlightenment can become a form of madness, isolating you not just from others, but from your own capacity for happiness and connection. Yet, Nietzsche also suggested that this danger might be necessary, that the evolution of human consciousness requires individuals willing to risk their sanity to see beyond the boundaries of their time. He saw himself as a bridge to future forms of human awareness, a sacrifice made necessary by humanity's psychological and spiritual development. The question he left us is this: knowing the risks, are there truths worth the price of seeing them? Modern neuroscience and psychology have confirmed what Nietzsche intuited through pure philosophical insight. The human mind is not designed to process unlimited reality. Our brains evolved sophisticated filtering mechanisms specifically to protect us from overwhelming truth, creating what psychologists now call cognitive biases, systematic errors in thinking that feel like rational thought but actually serve psychological protection functions. Consider confirmation bias, the tendency to seek information that confirms our existing beliefs while avoiding information that challenges them. This isn't a flaw in human reasoning, it's a feature. Our ancestors who spent their mental energy questioning fundamental assumptions about their world were less likely to survive than those who operated confidently within established frameworks, even if those frameworks contained errors. The same protective logic applies to cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort we feel when confronted with contradictory information. Rather than revising our worldview to accommodate new data, our minds instinctively work to eliminate the discomfort by rejecting, rationalizing, or reinterpreting information that doesn't fit our existing mental models. This process happens so automatically that most people never realize they're doing it. Terror management theory, developed by psychologist Ernest Becker and his followers, provides perhaps the most powerful explanation for why humans resist uncomfortable truths. According to this framework, most human behavior can be understood as elaborate death denial mechanisms. We create cultures, pursue achievements, build monuments, have children, and dedicate ourselves to causes because these activities provide the psychological illusion that our lives have permanent significance despite our inevitable mortality. This death denial isn't conscious or deliberate. It operates at such a fundamental level that questioning it can trigger what psychologists call mortality salience, a state of acute awareness of death that produces intense anxiety and defensive reactions. People experiencing mortality salience become more aggressive toward those who threaten their worldview, more committed to their cultural beliefs, and more hostile toward different ways of life. From this perspective, the comfortable illusions that Nietzsche identified as necessary fictions serve a crucial psychological function. They protect us from existential terror that would otherwise be paralyzing. Religion promises eternal life. Nationalism suggests our group will outlive our individual deaths. Career success implies our work has lasting meaning. Consumer culture offers the fantasy that we can purchase significance. But what happens when someone develops what psychologists call epistemic learned helplessness, the learned inability to stop questioning these protective frameworks? This is the psychological state Nietzsche described in those who see too clearly. They become trapped in a cycle of insight that systematically dismantles every comforting illusion without providing psychological alternatives. Consider the modern phenomenon of conspiracy thinking through this lens. While genuine paranoid delusion certainly exists, much of what gets dismissed as conspiracy theory represents an accurate perception of systematic manipulation that most people prefer not to acknowledge. The person who recognizes how media narratives are constructed, how political movements manufacture consent, how consumer psychology exploits cognitive vulnerabilities, this person hasn't necessarily become delusional. They may have simply developed the ability to see manipulative systems that others unconsciously participate in. This creates what we might call the Cassandra syndrome, named after the mythological figure cursed with accurate prophecy that no one would believe. Modern Cassandras find themselves in the psychologically devastating position of seeing real patterns of manipulation and control while being dismissed as paranoid by those who benefit from not seeing these patterns. The psychological pressure of this position can be overwhelming. Imagine trying to maintain relationships with people who seem to you like sleepwalkers, unconsciously participating in systems designed to exploit them. Imagine trying to function in institutions you recognize as fundamentally dishonest while maintaining your integrity. Imagine carrying knowledge about the extent of human manipulation and self-deception while being unable to share this knowledge without being labeled as mentally unstable. This is the Nietzschean trap, and once you begin seeing through societal illusions, you cannot unsee them. The comfortable boundaries that once provided psychological stability disappear, leaving you in a state of philosophical vertigo where all solid ground has vanished. You become like someone who has learned that they're living in a simulation, but cannot escape to whatever reality lies beyond it. The trap is compounded by the fact that sharing your insights often makes things worse rather than better. People don't thank you for revealing that their cherished beliefs serve psychological protection functions rather than truth-seeking. They don't appreciate learning that their daily routines involve unconscious participation in manipulative systems. They don't want to hear that many of their deepest convictions are elaborate forms of death denial rather than rational conclusions. So the person who sees too clearly faces a terrible choice: retreat into new forms of self-deception to preserve psychological stability and social connection, or maintain their clarity at the cost of increasing isolation and psychological stress. Neither option provides a complete solution, which is why Nietzsche suggested that most people who begin this journey either turn back or are destroyed by it. The question becomes, is there a third option? Can human consciousness evolve to handle greater doses of reality without psychological breakdown? Or are we forever trapped between the comfort of illusion and the terror of truth? Throughout history, certain individuals have embodied Nietzsche's warnings about the danger of seeing too clearly, each paying a devastating price for their refusal to participate in the comfortable illusions of their time. Their stories read like a recurring nightmare, each one following the same tragic arc: insight, isolation, persecution, and often destruction. Yet their sacrifice has driven human consciousness forward, forcing our species to confront truths it would prefer to avoid. Socrates, the gadfly of Athens, provides the archetypal example. In 399 BCE, he was executed by democratic vote for the crime of corrupting the youth and impiety toward the gods. But what had he actually done? He had developed a method of questioning that revealed the ignorance hidden beneath confident assertions. He had shown that people who claimed to possess knowledge, politicians, priests, craftsmen, poets, actually understood far less than they believed. The Socratic method wasn't a mere intellectual exercise. It was a systematic dismantling of the psychological foundations that made Athenian society function. When Socrates demonstrated that respected leaders couldn't define justice, courage, or virtue, he wasn't just winning philosophical debates, he was destroying the illusions that gave these leaders their authority and gave citizens their sense of security in following them. The psychological threat was so severe that Athens chose to execute him rather than continue tolerating his questions. Socrates could have escaped. His friends arranged for his flight from prison. But he chose to drink the hemlock, understanding that his commitment to truth-seeking required accepting the consequences of that commitment, even unto death. His final words, asking a friend to sacrifice a rooster to the god of healing, suggested he viewed death as a cure for the disease of existence itself. 15 centuries later, Galileo Galilei faced a similar choice when his observations through the telescope revealed that Earth was not the center of the universe. The Catholic Church's opposition wasn't merely religious, it was psychological. If humans weren't at the center of creation, if our planet were merely one rock among countless others orbiting an ordinary star, then what happened to human specialness? What happened to the meaning structures that justified earthly authority and made individual suffering bearable? Under threat of torture and execution, Galileo recanted his views publicly, while allegedly muttering, "And yet it moves," under his breath. Was this wisdom or cowardice? Perhaps it was the recognition that truth doesn't require martyrdom to remain true, that sometimes the bearer of dangerous knowledge must choose strategic retreat to preserve both their life and their insights for future generations. Moving into the modern era, we find George Orwell, whose clear sight into the nature of power and propaganda made him a prophetic voice of the 20th century. Orwell's experiences fighting in the Spanish Civil War, his observations of British imperialism in Burma, and his analysis of Stalinist totalitarianism gave him devastating insight into how political movements manufacture reality rather than simply reporting it. But this clarity came at enormous personal cost. Orwell lived much of his life in poverty, struggling to find publishers for work that made readers uncomfortable. His health deteriorated under the stress of carrying insights that few wanted to hear. He died at 46, worn down by tuberculosis and the psychological burden of seeing too clearly into the mechanisms of power and control that most people preferred to ignore. Perhaps no figure embodies the Nietzschean warning more completely than Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who spent 8 years in Soviet labor camps and emerged with unshakable insight into the nature of totalitarian control. His books, particularly The Gulag Archipelago, revealed the systematic brutality of Soviet communism in such vivid detail that they helped bring down the entire system. But Solzhenitsyn's clarity extended beyond political criticism to deeper questions about human nature and moral responsibility. He recognized that the horrors of the Soviet system weren't perpetrated by monsters, but by ordinary people who had surrendered their individual moral judgment to collective ideology. This insight proved so disturbing that even after becoming a celebrated dissident in the West, he remained a controversial figure, too uncompromising in his vision to be comfortably embraced by any political movement. In our contemporary era, we see the same pattern playing out with whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. Snowden's revelations about NSA surveillance programs showed the extent to which democratic governments spy on their own citizens. Assange's WikiLeaks publications revealed the gap between public diplomacy and private power calculations. Both men saw through the facade of democratic accountability and chose to reveal what they had seen, knowing the personal cost would be enormous. Snowden lives in exile in Russia, cut off from his homeland and former life. Assange spent years confined to the Ecuadorian embassy in London before being arrested and facing extradition to the United States. Neither man is universally celebrated. Both are dismissed by many as traitors, rather than truth-tellers. Their revelations about systematic, governmental deception have been largely absorbed into the news cycle without producing the democratic reforms they hope to inspire. Each of these figures faced the same terrible choice: remain silent about what they had seen and preserve their personal security and social acceptance, or speak truth and face the consequences. Each chose truth and paid the price that Nietzsche warned about, the price of seeing what others don't. But their stories also reveal something else. The insights they died or suffered for eventually became part of human consciousness. Socrates' questions became the foundation of Western philosophy. Galileo's observations became the basis of modern astronomy. Orwell's warnings about totalitarian manipulation became part of our political vocabulary. Solzhenitsyn's revelations helped end one of history's most brutal regimes. The pattern is clear. Those who see too clearly are often destroyed by their societies, but their insights survive to transform future generations. They are the advanced scouts of human consciousness, venturing into psychological territory that most minds cannot safely explore, and paying the price so that humanity can eventually follow more safely in their footsteps. This raises a profound question. Are we willing to accept the sacrifice of these exceptional individuals, or is there a way for humanity to develop greater collective tolerance for uncomfortable truths without destroying those who bear them? We live in an era that would have terrified and fascinated Nietzsche in equal measure, a time when the manipulation of human consciousness has become both more sophisticated and more pervasive than any previous generation could have imagined. The comfortable illusions he identified in 19th-century European society now pale in comparison to the digital matrix of algorithmic control, manufactured reality, and psychological manipulation that most people navigate unconsciously every day. Consider the algorithm that curates your social media feed. It feels natural, even personal. These are your friends' posts, news stories relevant to your interests, advertisements for products you might actually want. But this sense of organic discovery is entirely manufactured. The algorithm has analyzed thousands of data points about your behavior, cross-referenced them with the behavior patterns of millions of other users, and calculated precisely which content will maximize your engagement, time spent on the platform, and likelihood of clicking on advertisements. You're not seeing what's happening in the world. You're seeing a carefully constructed version of reality, designed to exploit your psychological vulnerabilities for profit. The algorithm knows which emotional triggers make you scroll longer, which types of content make you more likely to purchase products, and which political narratives increase your engagement, even if they increase your stress and anger. It feeds you a steady diet of precisely calibrated stimulation, designed to keep you psychologically dependent on the platform. Most users never recognize this manipulation because it's been designed to feel like an authentic choice. The recommendations seem to emerge from your own preferences and interests. The content feels personally relevant because it has been individually customized based on your psychological profile. You experience the illusion of agency while actually following a script written by artificial intelligence designed to maximize corporate profits. This is just one layer of a much more complex system of reality management. Modern propaganda has evolved far beyond the crude messaging of earlier eras. Today's influence campaigns operate through seemingly independent sources: social media influencers, grassroots movements, academic research, entertainment content, even memes, all coordinated to shape public opinion without revealing their coordination. The technique called astroturfing creates fake, grassroots movements that appear to emerge organically from public concern, but are actually funded and directed by corporate or political interests. The average person sees what appears to be an authentic public debate, but is actually witnessing a carefully orchestrated performance designed to manufacture consent for predetermined conclusions. News media, once imagined as an independent check on power, have become increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy individuals who use their platforms to shape political narratives rather than simply report facts. The line between journalism and propaganda has blurred to the point where most people cannot distinguish between reporting and opinion, between verified information and manufactured controversy. Entertainment industries embed political and social messages in content that audiences consume for pleasure, bypassing critical thinking by delivering propaganda through emotional engagement. Educational institutions, once dedicated to developing independent thinking, increasingly function as ideological training centers that teach students what to think rather than how to think. In this environment, the individuals who begin to see through these systems of manipulation find themselves in a position analogous to the philosophical awakening Nietzsche described, but amplified by the scale and complexity of modern illusion-making. They recognize that social media platforms are behavior modification systems rather than communication tools. They understand that news cycles are manufactured to serve political agendas rather than inform public understanding. They see through the performance of online culture to the psychological manipulation underneath. These modern seers face the same isolation that has always afflicted those who see too clearly, but with additional complications. Because digital manipulation is so sophisticated and pervasive, questioning it often gets dismissed as paranoid conspiracy thinking. The term conspiracy theorist has become a remarkably effective tool for discrediting anyone who questions official narratives, even when their skepticism is warranted by available evidence. The psychological pressure is intensified by the fact that opting out of digital manipulation systems often means opting out of modern social and economic life entirely. You cannot maintain professional relationships, access services, or participate in contemporary culture without engaging with platforms designed to manipulate your behavior. The person who sees through these systems faces a choice between authentic living and social isolation, even more extreme than what previous generations of clear seers experienced. Tech industry whistleblowers like Frances Haugen, who revealed Facebook's internal research showing the platform's harmful effects on users' mental health, represent the latest iteration of individuals who have seen too much and chosen to speak despite the personal cost. Their revelations confirm what many users suspect but don't want to fully acknowledge, that the platforms they depend on for social connection are designed to exploit their psychological vulnerabilities rather than serve their well-being. Similarly, journalists like Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, who have revealed the extent of cooperation between government agencies and tech platforms in shaping public discourse, find themselves marginalized by the same media institutions they once worked for. Their crime is not inaccurate, reporting but uncomfortable accuracy about how power operates in the digital age. The pattern Nietzsche identified, the tendency of societies to destroy those who see through their illusions, continues in the digital era, but with new mechanisms of control. Instead of execution or imprisonment, modern societies use economic pressure, social ostracism, and algorithmic suppression to silence those who see too clearly. Platforms can reduce the reach of content that challenges their interests. Search engines can bury information that contradicts preferred narratives. Payment processors can cut off funding to organizations that ask uncomfortable questions. Perhaps most insidiously, the sheer volume of information and competing narratives in the digital age makes it increasingly difficult to distinguish between legitimate insight and genuine paranoia. The person who correctly identifies systematic manipulation may find their warnings lost in a sea of actual conspiracy theories and delusional thinking, making it easier for those in power to dismiss all criticism as the product of unstable minds. This creates a new form of the Nietzschean trap. In an era of information overload and manufactured confusion, how do we distinguish between valuable clarity and destructive paranoia? How do we develop the wisdom to see through manipulation without losing our capacity for trust and social connection? And perhaps most importantly, how do we create space in our society for the voices of those who see what others don't, before their insights become too late to matter? Here we stand at the culmination of our journey through the dangerous territory of seeing too clearly, faced with the central question that has haunted every individual who has ever glimpsed the machinery behind society's comfortable illusions. What do we do with this knowledge? How do we live authentically in a world built on necessary fictions? How do we bear the burden of sight without being crushed by its weight? Nietzsche himself struggled with this question throughout his philosophical career, And his answer evolved into one of his most profound concepts, amor fati, literally love of fate. This wasn't mere acceptance of circumstance, but active embrace of one's entire existence, including its most difficult and isolating aspects. For those cursed with clear sight, amor fati means learning to love even the burden of seeing what others cannot or will not see. This love of fate isn't a masochistic embrace of suffering, but recognition that the alternative, retreat into comfortable delusion, represents a form of psychological death that Nietzsche considered worse than the isolation that comes with truth. The person who has seen through society's illusions cannot return to innocent participation in them without killing something essential in themselves, some core commitment to intellectual honesty that defines their deepest identity. But amor fati also suggests a path forward. Throughout history, the individuals who have borne the burden of dangerous knowledge most successfully have found ways to transform their isolation into creative power. Socrates used his clarity to develop new forms of philosophical inquiry. Galileo's observations became the foundation for the scientific revolution. Orwell channeled his insights into literature that continues to illuminate the nature of power decades after his death. The key insight is that the burden of seeing clearly need not be purely destructive. It can become a source of creative energy, driving innovation in thought, art, and social organization. The person who cannot participate authentically in existing systems may be precisely the person capable of imagining better alternatives. This brings us to Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, perhaps his most misunderstood idea. The Übermensch is not a master race or superhuman being, but simply an individual who has learned to create their own values and meaning after seeing through all inherited systems of significance. This is someone who can look into the abyss of meaninglessness without being destroyed by it, who can recognize the constructed nature of all human values without succumbing to nihilism or paralysis. The Übermensch represents a form of psychological evolution, the development of minds capable of handling greater doses of reality without protective illusions. This isn't about becoming emotionally invulnerable or socially isolated, but about developing the inner resources necessary to function authentically in a world where traditional sources of meaning have been revealed as human constructions rather than eternal truths. In practical terms, this means learning to distinguish between useful fictions and harmful delusions. Not all illusions are equally problematic. Some social conventions serve genuine functions in enabling cooperation and reducing conflict. The art lies in learning which illusions to maintain for practical purposes while remaining internally free from their psychological control. It means developing the capacity for what we might call conscious participation, engaging with social systems while remaining aware of their constructed nature. You can use social media while understanding its manipulative design. You can participate in political processes while recognizing their limitations. You can maintain relationships with people who operate within different frameworks of meaning without losing your own clarity. Perhaps most importantly, it means finding others who share your capacity for clear sight. One of the greatest sources of suffering for those who see too clearly is the isolation that comes from feeling alone in their perception. But throughout history, such individuals have found each other and formed communities of mutual support and intellectual development. The Internet, for all its manipulative potential, has also made it easier for clear seers to connect across geographical boundaries. The final element involves channeling the energy of clear sight into constructive rather than destructive directions. The person who sees through society's illusions has a choice: become bitter and cynical, focusing only on what's wrong with the world, or use their insights to contribute to better alternatives. This might mean creating art that helps others see more clearly, developing new forms of social organization, or simply modeling a more authentic way of living. The conclusion we reach is both sobering and empowering. Yes, the danger of seeing what others don't is real. The psychological isolation, the social rejection, the burden of carrying uncomfortable truths, these are genuine costs that cannot be minimized or explained away. Nietzsche's warnings about the abyss gazing back are not metaphorical but literal descriptions of psychological experiences that await those who push too far beyond the comfortable boundaries of conventional thinking. But the alternative, living in comfortable delusion while the world burns around us, participating unconsciously in systems of manipulation and control, surrendering our intellectual integrity for social acceptance, represents a different kind of death. It is the death of the very qualities that make us most human: our capacity for truth-seeking, our ability to think independently, our potential for authentic existence. In the end, the choice between comfortable illusion and dangerous truth is not really a choice at all, at least not for those who have already begun to see. Once you glimpse the machinery behind society's stage performance, once you recognize the algorithms shaping your thoughts and the narratives controlling your emotions, you cannot simply decide to forget what you've learned. The only real choice is how you respond to this knowledge, with despair or with courage, with isolation or with connection to others who share your burden, with destruction or with creation. The danger of seeing what others don't is real, but so is its potential for transformation, both personal and collective. We are living through a time when humanity desperately needs individuals capable of seeing clearly through the increasingly sophisticated systems of manipulation and control that shape our world. The price of this sight remains what Nietzsche warned it would be, but the cost of blindness has never been higher. The question is not whether we can afford to see clearly, but whether we can afford not to. The abyss is still there, and it still gazes into those who gaze into it. But with enough people willing to bear the burden of sight, we can finally stare back without blinking.